December 1971. Around a large three-story mansion in a prestigious neighborhood of Westfield, New Jersey, there reigns a complete, ominous silence. The 19-room house, with its grand columns and luxurious ballroom, where a real glass dome crafted by a prominent master sparkles on the ceiling, looks completely abandoned. Heavy curtains are tightly drawn across the windows, through which not a single ray of light pierces. The driveway is empty, and mail and fresh newspapers are accumulating by the front door. Neighbors notice that light burns day and night in all the rooms of the mansion, but there is no movement inside. It seems as though a large, wealthy family simply suddenly packed their bags and left for a long vacation before the Christmas holidays. It was an ideal illusion of prosperity, created by a man with an incredibly cold, calculating mind. Everything looked so natural that it never crossed anyone's mind to look inside this luxury crypt. Adults walked past the house. Children played nearby on the street, and their inner intuition remained silent, soothed by the external tranquility of a wealthy provincial life. Who could have known that behind these beautiful walls, real darkness and death had been reigning for almost a month? The predator did not just destroy those who shared this space with him. He cold-bloodedly turned his own home into a mass grave, where the bodies lay in a row on sleeping bags in the middle of a large hall. And the most amazing thing lies elsewhere. The answer to the question of where the entire family had vanished and who had staged this bloody performance, the police could not find for 18 years. 18 years of the absolute helplessness of the law, while the killer calmly walked free, changed his face, got a new wife, and calculated other people's taxes in a completely different state. Justice caught up with him only when forensic science combined with the high arts of forensic sculpture to mold his true, aged essence out of clay. If this terrifying picture of family vulnerability before the eyes of a cold-blooded monster ignites a fire inside you, if your inner sense of righteousness demands answers, stop right now and leave a comment under this video with just one word: justice. Because it was this very word that drove detectives for almost 2 decades to look for a man who had completely erased his past and turned into an invisible ghost. John List was a man who, at first glance, embodied the American dream. He was born into a deeply religious family, raised in strict puritanical traditions, where every step was controlled by a stern father. John grew up to be a withdrawn, incredibly pedantic, and emotionally deaf young man. He received a good education, became a successful accountant and financial analyst, served in the army, and participated in combat operations during World War II. In 1951, he married a woman named Helen. They had 3 wonderful children, a daughter, Patricia, and sons, John and Frederick. The family looked exemplary. They went to a Lutheran church every Sunday, the children attended good schools, and John held high positions in major banks. In the late 60s, John List bought that very luxury mansion called Breeze Knoll. It was the symbol of his absolute triumph. The huge house, where his elderly mother Alma also settled with them, was meant to be the fortress of their family happiness. John adored order. Every item in the mansion had to lie in its place, and every cent had to be accounted for in his ledger books. Daughter Patricia grew up to be a talented girl. She was fond of the school theater and dreamed of becoming an actress, while the sons loved sports and ordinary teenage entertainment. But behind this perfect white facade, darkness was already beginning to gather. But this was only the beginning of the horror that was brewing in the mind of the head of the family. John List began to rapidly lose control over his life. First, he was fired from his position as vice president of a major bank in New Jersey due to an inability to get along with the staff and excessive reclusiveness. For a man with such morbid pride, this was a devastating blow. He could not bring himself to confess this failure to his family. Every morning, John put on his expensive business suit, took his leather briefcase, and pretended to go to work. In reality, he sat at the train station all day reading newspapers, or wandered the city streets trying to find a way out. His financial situation was rolling into an abyss. He began secretly withdrawing money from his elderly mother's bank accounts to pay the huge bills for maintaining the 19-room mansion. Debts grew every day like a snowball. At the same time, serious health problems began in the house. His wife Helen suffered from a severe form of a chronic illness that she had contracted from her first military husband. Her mental state was deteriorating. She began abusing alcohol and openly mocking John for his financial helplessness. Daughter Patricia began to show teenage rebellion. She refused to go to church, became interested in occultism and religious movements that John considered a direct path to hell. For an Orthodox Puritan whose world was held together by absolute discipline and external status, this was a total collapse. His long-standing inner instinct for control transformed into a terrifying, cold paranoia. John calculated that his family had lost their righteousness, and if they ended up on the street in poverty, they would definitively turn away from God and fall into darkness. And then the accountant made the most horrific decision of his life. He decided that the only way to save their souls for eternal life was to send them to heaven early, before they had time to fully sin. The details that were discovered later made even experienced detectives shudder when they finally stepped over the threshold of the Breeze Knoll mansion. John List planned everything with the precision of a financial report. He developed this plan for several weeks. First, he carefully withdrew all the remaining money from his mother's accounts. Then, he went to a local gun store and purchased 2 pistols. After that, he wrote official letters to the schools where the children studied and to the music teachers, claiming that the family was urgently leaving for another state for a few weeks to care for a sick relative. He even warned the mailman and the milkman to temporarily stop delivery to their house. November 1971. Saturday, the 9th. The morning began absolutely normally. John waited until the children left for school and practice. As soon as they closed the door behind them, he poured himself a cup of coffee and went up to the second floor into his wife's bedroom. Helen was still lying in bed. John stepped closer, pulled out the weapon, and cold-bloodedly shot her in the head. She died instantly. After that, he went up to the 3rd floor, into the small, cozy room of his 80-year-old mother, Alma. The old woman heard a strange sound and asked what happened. John approached, kissed her gently, and then fired another shot. His mother's body was too heavy, so he left her there on the 3rd floor, merely covering her face with a blanket. Conveniently, all too conveniently, it was for the killer to execute his plan further, as there were no more adults in the house who could hinder him. John went down to the 1st floor, took rags, a bucket of water, and cleaning supplies. He thoroughly, centimeter by centimeter, washed away all the blood in his wife's bedroom so that the children would not notice anything ahead of time when they returned. Then he calmly made himself lunch and sat down to wait. 16-year-old Patricia was the first to return home. She walked into the kitchen, holding her school briefcase in her hands. Her father approached her from behind and shot her in the back of the head. She fell to the floor next to her textbooks. Behind her came the youngest son, 13-year-old Frederick. John met him in the hallway and eliminated him just as quickly and ruthlessly. But with the oldest son, 15-year-old John Jr., everything did not go according to plan. The boy returned later, as he had been at football practice. When he entered the house, his inner intuition must have told him something, or he noticed signs of a struggle. The boy began to fight desperately for his life. He ran around the large hall, trying to break out into the street. The father pursued him, firing from both pistols. The son received 9 gunshot wounds. 9. He fought until his last breath, but the cold-bloodedness of the killer won. Stop here for a moment and think about this. What level of psychopathy one must possess to not lose self-control for a single second after destroying their entire family? John List did not panic. He acted like a professional accountant closing the balance at the end of the month. He moved the bodies of his wife and 3 children to the large ballroom. He neatly placed them in a row on sleeping bags, smoothed their clothes, and folded their hands across their chests. After that, he went up to his study, sat down at his desk, and wrote a long, emotional 5-page letter to his pastor. In this letter, he explained in detail, point by point, that he committed these murders solely out of love for his family, to save them from poverty and sin, and to guarantee them a place in heaven. He sincerely begged the pastor to understand his action. After that, John thoroughly washed the entire mansion, packed all his things and documents. He went up to every family photograph hanging on the walls of the house, took scissors, and neatly cut his face out of every single picture. He did this so that the police would not have a single recent photo of him for wanted posters. Then he turned on a religious radio station to full volume so that the sounds of church psalms echoed through all the rooms, turned on the lights throughout the mansion, locked the doors, and calmly drove his car to JFK Airport. He left his car in the parking lot while he himself boarded a train and vanished in an unknown direction. The calendar read November 9th, 1971. Back then, they did not yet know that they were looking for a ghost who had completely crossed out his identity. The bodies of the List family lay in the locked Breeze Knoll mansion for almost an entire month. Only on December 7th, 1971, school teachers who noticed the prolonged absence of the children and neighbors who grew troubled by the constantly burning lights and the strange religious music echoing from behind the locked windows called the patrol. Police officers entered the house through a basement window. When they went up to the large ballroom under the glass dome, a scene unfolded before them that forever changed the life of every member of that group. In the center of the room, 4 bodies lay in a row covered with blankets, while the religious radio continued to play psalms. The police found the letter to the pastor, found the murder weapons, but John List himself was nowhere to be found. The search operation was striking in scale, but from the very beginning, law enforcement found themselves in a complete dead end. They did not have a single current photograph of the killer, only old pictures from many years ago where he looked completely different. The Federal Bureau of Investigation mobilized patrols across the country. His description was broadcast on all television channels, but John List seemed to have dissolved into thin air. His car was found at the airport a few weeks later, which pushed the investigation toward a false theory that he had fled abroad or committed suicide by jumping into the ocean. The case began to grow rapidly cold. After some time, the Breeze Knoll mansion burned down under mysterious circumstances during a night fire, destroying the last material traces of that terrible Saturday, and the crystal dome of the ballroom shattered into thousands of tiny pieces. The town tried to forget this horror, and the case was placed on an archival shelf for long years. But this was only the beginning of the second, hidden part of this criminal puzzle. While New Jersey detectives unsuccessfully reviewed old papers, John List was building his new, absolutely perfect life. He arrived in the state of Colorado under the assumed name of Robert Clark. He claimed that he had lost all his documents in a fire, obtained a new Social Security card and a driver's license. The man completely changed his appearance. He began wearing large glasses in thick, horn-rimmed frames, changed his hairstyle, grew a small beard, and radically altered his clothing style. His inner instinct as a pedantic accountant never vanished. He again found a job as a clerk in a small company, demonstrating incredible accuracy in calculations. He behaved so quietly, modestly, and reliably that his colleagues considered him an exemplary citizen. Moreover, John again began actively attending a local Lutheran church, became a leader of the religious community, and started helping the poor. In 1985, this respected accountant married for a second time under his assumed name. His new wife, a woman named Dolores, was charmed by his calmness, religiosity, and serious attitude toward life. They bought a beautiful house in the state of Virginia, where they later relocated due to his new job. John List completely recreated a duplicate of his past life, but this time without debts and family scandals. He was absolutely certain that time had buried his secret forever, and not a single person in the world would be able to connect the modest accountant Robert Clark with the bloody monster from New Jersey. Conveniently, all too conveniently, it was for the killer to think that he had outsmarted the entire law enforcement system of the United States of America. Almost 20 years passed. The case was considered completely dead until, in 1989, a new Union County detective named Charles Bangs decided to try one last, absolutely crazy chance. He turned to the producers of the popular television show America's Most Wanted, which engaged in searching for the most dangerous criminals during a live broadcast. The producers agreed to air John List's story, but the same old problem arose. They did not have a photograph of what the killer looked like now, 18 years after the commission of the crime. And then the detective made a brilliant move. He turned to a unique specialist, a forensic sculptor and anthropologist named Frank Binder. This man possessed an incredible, almost mystical sense of human anatomy. Binder took old photographs of John List, photographs of his parents to understand the genetic predisposition to aging, and studied his psychological profile provided by analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sculptor learned that List was a man of iron habits who would never betray his style. Binder locked himself in his workshop for several weeks, took a piece of gray clay, and literally began to manually grow the killer's face through time. He calculated how, under the influence of age, List's facial muscles would sag, where deep wrinkles would appear, and how his cheeks and chin would change. But most importantly, the sculptor selected for the bust precisely those large, horn-rimmed glasses which, in the opinion of psychologists, such a pedantic accountant trying to look respectable ought to wear. This was not just working with material, it was a total mental penetration into the mind of a psychopath. If this story and the amazing confrontation of human talent against the absolute cold-bloodedness of a killer makes your heart beat faster, share this video, because every person who learns about this unique precedent is another voice in favor of the fact that no crime has the right to be forgotten, and the memory of innocent children must live forever. May 1989. The next episode of the television show went on national air. Millions of viewers across the country glued themselves to their screens when the host began telling the story of the horror in Westfield and finally showed in the frame a three-dimensional clay bust created by Frank Binder. The face of an elderly man in glasses with a cold, frozen gaze appeared on the screen. At that moment in the state of Colorado, a woman who had been a neighbor of the Clark family before their move to Virginia was watching the show. She froze in horror. The clay head on the screen was such a precise copy of her acquaintance, the accountant Robert Clark, that she had no doubts left. The woman immediately picked up the receiver and dialed the hotline number. She told detectives that Robert Clark worked as an accountant, wore the exact same glasses, had the same pedantic character, and attended church very actively. The Federal Bureau of Investigation reacted instantly. On June 1, 1989, agents arrived at the office of the company in Virginia where the man worked. They entered the office, approached the desk behind which sat a neat elderly accountant in a suit, and asked him to state his real name. The man calmly presented documents in the name of Robert Clark and stated that a terrible mistake had occurred. He composed himself incredibly confidently. His voice did not tremble, and not a single emotion of fear or anxiety appeared on his face. During several days of interrogations, he continued to insist that he knew nothing about the murders in New Jersey. But forensic experts took his fingerprints and compared them with the archival records of John List's military service from the period of World War II. Paper knows no compromises. The patterns on the fingers of the elderly accountant completely, 100%, matched the drawing on the card from 40 years ago. They had found John List. But this was only the beginning of the final judicial act of this family drama. When fingerprints completely shattered his fictitious identity, John List finally stopped the game and admitted who he really was. He was transported under convoy back to the state of New Jersey, to the very streets where 18 years ago he had left the bodies of his mother, wife, and 3 children. The judicial process, which began in 1990, riveted the attention of the entire world. The killer's defense tried to build a line on the argument that John acted in a state of deep mental disorder and severe stress due to the financial collapse caused by the loss of his job. They invited well-known psychiatrists who claimed that List had developed a special obsessive-compulsive syndrome that forced him to make this absurd religious decision. But the prosecution completely demolished these arguments by showing the jurors the 5-page letter to the pastor and the neatly cut-out faces from the photographs. The prosecutor proved that John List acted with the absolute icy cold-bloodedness of a conscious psychopath. He had no disorder. He simply possessed a morbid, selfish pride that did not allow him to admit his financial failure before the community, and he decided to destroy his family to preserve his status as a righteous man in the eyes of God. The jury found him guilty on all counts of the indictment. The judge sentenced John List to 5 life prison terms, which he was to serve one after another without any right to parole. During the pronouncement of the sentence, the judge spoke words that forever entered the history of jurisprudence. John List is deprived of the right to breathe the air of freedom because his cold-bloodedness exceeds everything this court has ever seen. The killer did not display a single emotion of remorse. He calmly listened to the verdict and was sent to a maximum security cell. John List died in prison in 2008 from complications of pneumonia at the age of 82. No one claimed his body, and he was buried in an unmarked grave at state expense. His new wife Dolores, who had lived with him for several years under an assumed name, filed for divorce after his arrest and completely vanished from the sight of the press, stating that her life had been ruined by the terrible lie of her husband. This case remains a unique example in the judicial practice of the United States of America, which proved that darkness can hide under the guise of the most obedient, religious, and modest citizen of society. Evil does not always come from dark alleys from vagrants. Sometimes it buys large houses with ballrooms and cuts its faces out of photographs at the kitchen table. A long-standing instinct for control and pride are capable of turning a person into a monster for whom accounting precision becomes more important than the lives of their own children. Take care of your families, be attentive to those who are near, and remember that time never washes away the traces of blood. See you in the next investigation.